The morning air clung to Daniel's seat like a damp shroud. The chill stung his lungs with every breath, the forest around him alive with the whisper of early autumn. A layer of mist curled between the thick pines, softening the jagged edges of the wilderness that stretched endlessly in every direction. The narrow dirt trail wound deeper into the forest, swallowed by the canopy of branches overhead, where sunlight filtered through in fractured beams. Somewhere far off a raven croaked, a low, throaty call that echoed briefly before being smothered by the silence. Daniel tugged the straps on his backpack tighter across his shoulders and whistled softly for Bear, his German shepherd. The dog trotted back to his side, ears pricked, eyes bright with excitement. Bear had always been Daniel's shadow, his unwavering companion through thick and thin, through heartbreaks and sleepless nights. Now the dog bounded ahead again, weaving through the underbrush, his tail a happy blur. Behind Daniel, Kayla lagged slightly, brushing a loose strand of auburn hair from her flushed face. Her breath came in small, controlled bursts, the effort of the hike beginning to show on her. Daniel turned and offered a teasing grin. "Regretting this yet?" Kayla rolled her eyes but smiled, the corners of her lips twitching upward. "Not yet, but don't get cocky. We've still got a long way to go." They both knew the hike was more than just an escape from the city. They needed this weekend. Things between them had been strained lately, brittle conversations that cracked under the weight of unspoken tension. Daniel hoped that the wilderness might offer them a way to reconnect, far from the suffocating hum of deadlines and missed messages. Nature, he thought, had a way of stripping things down to their essence. Out here, all they had was each other. And Bear, of course. A gust of wind whistled through the trees, rustling the canopy. Daniel inhaled deeply, taking in the earthy scent of pine needles and wet leaves. It was the kind of smell that lingered on your clothes for days, a stubborn reminder of the wild. There was something peaceful about being this far from civilization, disconnected from the noise and clutter of their lives. But beneath that peace, Daniel couldn't quite shake a subtle undercurrent of unease, something he couldn't yet name. Bear stopped abruptly, his ears twitching as he stared into the dense woods to their right. A low growl rumbled from his throat. "What's up, boy?" Daniel asked, frowning. Kayla stopped beside him, following Bear's gaze into the forest. "What do you think he sees?" "Probably a deer," Daniel guessed, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. He scratched the back of his neck. "Come on, Bear. Leave it alone." Bear hesitated a moment longer, the fur along his spine bristling slightly, but then he gave a small huff and trotted back to them. Daniel ruffled the dog's ears, brushing off the moment, but the way Bear had reacted stirred a flicker of discomfort though in his chest. The trail ahead narrowed, winding between jagged rocks and fallen logs coated in slick moss. They were miles away from the nearest town, deep enough into the forest that even cell reception had flickered out an hour ago. Daniel liked it that way, or at least he thought he did, but the further they went, the quieter everything seemed. Too quiet, even for the wilderness. "Hey, Daniel." Kayla's voice was soft, hesitant. "Yeah?" "Do you ever get the feeling," she trailed off, chewing on her bottom lip, "like we're being watched?" Daniel chuckled, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. "You've been watching too many horror movies." Kayla gave a half-hearted laugh, but it didn't reach her eyes. They pressed on, the uneasy silence settling over them like a second skin. Daniel tried to focus on the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the forest floor, the snap of twigs beneath Bear's paws. But even the familiar presence of his dog wasn't enough to dispel the tension gnawing at the edges of his mind. As they moved deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, sharper. The sun, once a comforting presence overhead, began to dip behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the trail. The light took on a strange quality, dimming too fast, as if the forest were drawing a curtain over itself. "Maybe we should set up camp soon," Kayla suggested, glancing nervously at the sky. Daniel checked his watch. They still had at least another hour of daylight, but the idea of stopping early didn't seem so bad. "Yeah, good idea." They found a small clearing just off the trail, ringed by towering pines that swayed gently in the wind. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, a carpet of gold and amber that crunched underfoot. Daniel dropped his pack with a sigh of relief, rolling his shoulders to ease the stiffness. Bear immediately began sniffing around the perimeter of the clearing, nose to the ground. As Daniel and Kayla worked together to set up the tent, an easy silence fell between them. It felt almost normal, the weight of their recent arguments fading in the face of the simple task. They moved in tandem like they used to, handing each other poles, securing the stakes, working side by side without the need for words. But as the tent finally took shape, Daniel noticed something strange. The forest around them had gone eerily still. No birdsong, no rustle of animals in the underbrush. Nothing but the low whisper of the wind threading through the trees. "Do you hear that?" Kayla whispered. Daniel nodded slowly, his pulse quickening. Even Bear had stopped moving, standing perfectly still at the edge of the clearing, ears cocked forward. His body was tense, every muscle coiled as if waiting for something. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. "Let's get a fire going," he said quietly, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. Kayla nodded, her hands moving quickly. Quickly as she gathered kindling from their packs. Daniel struck a match and coaxed the flame to life, feeding it small twigs until the fire crackled and danced. The warmth was welcome, but it did little to dispel the growing sense of unease curling in his gut. Bear let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the darkened woods beyond the firelight. The hairs along his back bristled, and his lips curled slightly, exposing his teeth. "What is it, boy?" Daniel whispered, though he already knew. Something was out there. Something was watching them. Kayla edged closer to Daniel, her hand brushing his. He could feel the tension radiating from her, the fear she was trying hard not to show. "Daniel!" "I know," he murmured, his heart thudding against his ribs. He reached for Bear's collar, gripping it tightly. "Stay close!" The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling into the night. Beyond its glow, the forest stretched into impenetrable darkness, the trees like silent sentinels. And somewhere out there, just beyond their sight, something waited. Daniel's grip on Bear tightened as the first distant howl echoed through the night, low, mournful, and haunting. The sound raised the hairs on the back of his neck, and for a moment he could feel the primal weight of it. The wilderness was not theirs to claim. Out here, they were intruders. Kayla's hand slipped into his, squeezing tightly. "We should have stayed home," she whispered. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. "It's going to be fine," he said, though the words rang hollow. And deep down, he knew. The wolves had found them. The howling ceased as abruptly as it had begun, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the forest. Daniel strained to hear more, but the silence that followed was heavier than before, like the woods were holding their breath. Bear stood rigid at the edge of the firelight, his tail low, ears twitching toward every faint rustle in the dark. A low growl hummed from his throat, and Daniel's hand tightened on the dog's collar, trying to reassure him, or maybe himself. "Maybe it was just one wolf," Kayla offered, though her voice wavered. "They're not supposed to attack people, right?" Daniel knew the truth, but didn't want to say it aloud. Wolves rarely attacked humans, but when they did, it was usually because something was wrong, hunger, disease, or desperation. And those kinds of wolves didn't care about rules. Kayla leaned closer to Daniel, her breath quick and shallow. She was scared, and her fear was infectious, wrapping around Daniel's thoughts and squeezing tight. "Let's just stay calm," he whispered. "Wolves hunt in packs, but if we keep the fire going, they'll stay away. They're more afraid of us than we are of them." But even as he said it, Daniel wasn't sure he believed it. He kept his eyes trained on the edge of the clearing, scanning the shifting shadows. Every creak of a tree, every crunch of leaves underfoot felt like a prelude to something worse. Bear suddenly lunged forward with a sharp bark, yanking the collar from Daniel's grasp. The dog bolted into the darkness, disappearing between the trees. "Bear!" Daniel shouted, panic rising in his chest. He scrambled to his feet, but Kayla grabbed his arm. "Daniel, wait!" she hissed. "You can't go after him. We don't know what's out there." But Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs, and his instincts screamed at him to run after Bear. That dog was more than just a pet. He was family. He'd had Bear since the pup was 6 weeks old, through breakups, job changes, and the long, lonely nights when no one else was there. He couldn't leave him out there alone. "I can't just leave him," Daniel snapped, pulling his arm free from Kayla's grip. She stared at him, wide-eyed and desperate, as if she knew something he didn't. "If you go, you might not come back," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. Daniel hesitated, torn between two impossible choices. He looked from the dark forest to Kayla, and then back again. Bear's barks echoed faintly in the distance, growing fainter by the second. "I have to," he muttered, more to himself than to Kayla. "He's my responsibility." Kayla's hand fell to her side, defeated. She didn't argue, but her eyes shimmered with unspoken fear. "Stay here," Daniel instructed, though his voice was heavy with guilt. "Keep the fire going. I'll find him and be right back." Without waiting for her reply, Daniel grabbed his flashlight and bolted toward the woods, his breath ragged as he plunged into the darkness. The trees closed in around him, branches snagging his jacket and scraping his arms. The beam from his flashlight bounced wildly, casting fleeting glimpses of the forest floor. "Bear, Bear, come!" Daniel shouted into the night, his voice strained with desperation. The dog's barks grew louder for a moment, then suddenly stopped, leaving an eerie void in their wake. Daniel's stomach dropped. "Bear!" he called again, louder this time. But there was no answer, only the oppressive silence pressing in from all sides. Daniel stumbled over a fallen log, catching himself just in time to avoid a faceplant. He panted, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold air. It was as if the forest had swallowed Bear whole, erasing his presence. And then Daniel saw them. Tracks. In the soft mud near the base of a tree were deep impressions of paws. At first, Daniel's heart lifted, thinking they were Bear's. But as he knelt to inspect them, his stomach twisted in dread. The prints were too large. These belonged to wolves. A shiver crawled down Daniel's spine. The tracks were fresh, leading deeper into the forest, and they were joined by more, many more. He swung his flashlight ahead, and his heart skipped a beat. Something flickered in the distance, just at the edge of the light's reach. A pair of eyes, glowing yellow and predatory. The reflection vanished as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the shadows. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. He knew what he was seeing, and it wasn't just one wolf. It was the pack. The growl came from somewhere close, low and rumbling, vibrating through the air like a warning. Daniel froze, gripping the flashlight so tight his knuckles whitened. "Bear," he whispered, though he knew his dog wasn't the one growling. A soft rustle in the underbrush sent Daniel's heart into his throat. He turned slowly, swinging the beam of the flashlight, and found himself staring into the glowing eyes of a wolf, barely 10 feet away. The wolf was enormous, its fur matted and dark as the night, with amber eyes that gleamed with terrifying intelligence. It stood perfectly still, watching Daniel with an unsettling calm, as if waiting for something. Daniel took a step back, his breath hitching in his throat. But as he did, more shapes emerged from the darkness. 3, 5, 7 wolves, slipping silently between the trees like ghosts. They circled him slowly, their eyes glowing in the dark, their breath visible in the frigid air. Panic clawed at Daniel's mind. He turned in a slow circle, heart pounding, flashlight beam jittering as he tried to keep all the wolves in sight at once. "Easy," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't want any trouble." The wolves didn't respond, didn't flinch. They just kept circling, inching closer with every passing second. And then Daniel saw him. Bear. His loyal German shepherd stood frozen between two of the wolves, his ears flat against his skull, his tail tucked between his legs. He looked terrified but unharmed. Relief flooded Daniel's chest, but it was short-lived. One of the wolves, larger than the rest, with a scar running across its muzzle, took a step toward Bear, teeth bared in a silent warning. "No," Daniel whispered, his throat dry. "Leave him alone." The scarred wolf glanced at Daniel, then back at Bear, as if weighing its options. And that's when Daniel understood. They were giving him a choice. His heart lurched as the implications sank in. If he made the wrong move, Bear wouldn't survive the night. And then, as if to twist the knife, Daniel heard Kayla's distant voice calling his name. The wolves shifted slightly at the sound, their glowing eyes flickering with new interest. "Daniel?" Kayla's voice was closer now, threading through the trees, laced with fear. She was coming after him. Daniel's breath hitched. He was running out of time, caught between two impossible decisions: stay and protect his dog, or go back to Kayla and keep her safe. The scarred wolf took another step toward Bear, its eyes locked onto Daniel's. The message was clear. Choose now. And for the first time in his life, Daniel felt truly helpless. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out every rational thought. His hands trembled as the wolves closed in around Bear. The scarred leader, with its jagged muzzle and unblinking amber eyes, stood between Daniel and his dog, as if daring him to act. Kayla's distant voice drifted closer through the forest, her calls laced with worry. Time was slipping away. Bear whimpered softly, his large brown eyes pleading with Daniel. The sight twisted a knot in his chest. How could he abandon the creature who had never once left his side? But Kayla's presence in the forest meant she was walking straight into danger. A choice. The wolves demanded one, and Daniel knew they wouldn't wait much longer. He crouched slowly, his flashlight casting wild beams across the shadows as he tried to think. Should he defend Bear and risk Kayla finding herself surrounded, or leave his best friend behind to save the woman he still loved, despite everything? "Bear, I'm sorry, buddy," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. The words tasted like ash. Bear let out a low whine as if sensing what Daniel was about to do. The wolves remained eerily still, eyes flicking between the man and the dog, awaiting his next move. Fight or flight? A half-second decision. Daniel snatched a rock from the forest floor and hurled it toward the scarred wolf with every ounce of strength he had. The rock hit the ground near its paws, skimming the dirt. The wolf's lips peeled back in a silent snarl, but it didn't lunge. Instead, the pack seemed to shift, like a coiled spring, sensing his aggression and adjusting their positions. "Bear, run!" Daniel screamed. The dog bolted, darting toward the nearest thicket in a blur of fur and muscle, just as one of the smaller wolves gave chase. Daniel's heart sank. If Bear stopped, if he hesitated, they would kill him. But the German shepherd was fast, faster than the wolf behind him. All Daniel could do now was hope that Bear would disappear into the dark, far away from this nightmare. The wolves turned their attention back to Daniel, no longer divided between man and beast. A low growl rippled through the pack, a collective sound that seemed to come from every direction at once. He knew what would come next. They had chosen to deal with him first. "Daniel!" Kayla's voice sliced through the tension, closer now, too close. "No, stay back!" Daniel shouted, spinning toward the sound of her footsteps. He could see her flashlight bobbing through the trees, her silhouette stumbling forward in a panic. "Don't come any closer!" he cried, desperation thick in his voice. But it was too late. Kayla burst into the clearing, her eyes wide with confusion and terror as they locked onto the glowing forms of the wolves. She froze mid-step, gasping as the realization hit her. "Daniel, oh my God." The scarred wolf's gaze flicked from Daniel to Kayla, calculating, hungry. Daniel could feel the pack shift again, sensing a new opportunity. One mistake would mean death for both of them. "Get behind me," Daniel hissed, positioning himself between Kayla and the wolves. She stumbled toward him, her face pale as the gravity of the situation sank in. "We have to run," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel shook his head. "We won't make it." His breath came in short bursts, adrenaline threatening to drown out every rational thought. They were surrounded. The scarred wolf stepped closer, lips pulling back to reveal sharp, glistening fangs. Its pack followed, their movements deliberate and slow, savoring the tension like predators playing with their prey. Daniel scanned the clearing, searching desperately for an escape. There had to be a way out. The fire. If they could reach the fire, it might be enough to keep the wolves at bay, at least for a little while. "Kayla, listen to me," he said urgently, grabbing her arm. "On my signal, we run. Straight back to the fire. Do not stop. Do not look back. Got it?" Kayla's wide eyes shimmered with tears, but she nodded, clutching his hand like a lifeline. Daniel's heart pounded as the scarred wolf crouched, preparing to pounce. The other wolves mirrored its movement, muscles coiling beneath thick fur. Now or never. "Go!" Daniel shouted, shoving Kayla forward. She took off, sprinting toward the faint glow of the firelight, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. Daniel was right behind her, feet pounding against the forest floor. The wolves exploded into motion, snarls and barks ripping through the air as they pursued. Daniel could feel the hot breath of one wolf snapping at his heels, the sound of paws pounding like drumbeats in his ears. "Faster, Kayla!" he shouted, his lungs burning with the effort. The fire was their only chance. The clearing came into view, and Kayla burst through the tree line, skidding to a stop next to the fire pit. She spun around, eyes wide with terror, as Daniel crashed through the underbrush behind her. He barely made it. A wolf lunged just as he leapt over the fire, its jaws snapping shut inches from his leg. The beast recoiled from the flames, snarling in frustration. Daniel grabbed a burning stick from the edge of the fire and brandished it like a weapon, swinging wildly. "Stay back!" he roared. The wolves circled the fire, their glowing eyes never leaving Daniel and Kayla. The scarred wolf stood just beyond the flames, watching them with cold, calculating precision. They weren't retreating. They were waiting. "We can't stay here," Kayla whispered, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" Daniel's mind raced. The wolves wouldn't leave, not unless they were forced to. He had to think, had to come up with something fast. And then it hit him. The tent. "Kayla, the tent! Grab the sleeping bags!" Daniel shouted. She hesitated only a moment before diving into the tent. Daniel kept the wolves at bay with the flaming stick, swinging it back and forth as they crept closer to the edge of the firelight. Kayla emerged with 2 sleeping bags, her hands shaking as she handed one to Daniel. "What are we doing?" she asked, panic lacing her words. We wrap them around us, Daniel explained hurriedly. If we move slowly, we can use the fire to shield us. It was a desperate plan, but it was all they had. Together, they wrapped the sleeping bags around their bodies, holding the thick fabric tight. Daniel kept the burning stick in one hand, his other hand gripping Kayla's. "Stay close," he whispered. "We're going to walk toward the trail, slowly." Kayla nodded, her eyes locked on the snarling wolves. With painstaking slowness, they began to move, inching toward the trail while keeping the fire between them and the wolves. The pack growled and snapped, frustrated by the barrier of flames. The scarred wolf prowled along the edge of the firelight, its amber eyes locked on Daniel. It knew this was their last stand. Step by agonizing step, Daniel and Kayla moved closer to the trail. The wolves pressed in, their growls rising in pitch. And then, without warning, one of the wolves lunged. Daniel swung the burning stick with all his strength, striking the wolf across the snout. The beast yelped, recoiling into the darkness. "Go!" Daniel shouted. They broke into a sprint, the sleeping bags trailing behind them like capes as they raced down the trail. The wolves followed, their snarls echoing through the night. But the fire had bought them precious seconds, just enough to gain a lead. They ran, hearts pounding, lungs burning, until the snarls faded into the distance. Finally, they stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath. The forest around them was silent once more. Kayla collapsed to her knees, sobbing with relief. Daniel knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her trembling frame. "We made it," he whispered, though his voice was hollow with exhaustion. But even as they sat there, catching their breath, Daniel knew the truth. The wolves had given him a choice, and somehow, against all odds, he had chosen both. Daniel and Kayla clung to each other, breathless and trembling, but the silence of the forest offered little comfort. The wolves were still out there, waiting just beyond the veil of darkness. The fire might have bought them a few precious moments, but Daniel knew it wouldn't stop the pack forever. They had tasted pursuit, and they wouldn't give up that easily. Kayla pulled away from him slightly, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the dim glow of their remaining flashlight. "We can't stay here," she whispered, fear choking her words. "They'll come back." Daniel nodded grimly, glancing around the woods as his mind raced. His legs felt like dead weight, every muscle burning with exhaustion, but stopping was not an option. They had to keep moving. Then, like a gut-punch reminder, Bear came to mind. Daniel's heart clenched painfully at the thought of his dog somewhere out in the darkness, alone, terrified, or worse. He couldn't leave him out here. He wouldn't. "Kayla," he said softly, squeezing her hand, "I have to go find Bear." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "What? No, Daniel, we have to stick together. If we split up—" "I can't leave him out there," Daniel interrupted, his voice thick with guilt. "He's my responsibility. He saved me more times than I can count. Now it's my turn." Kayla's lip quivered, and Daniel could see the war raging in her mind, the terror of being alone versus the fear of losing Daniel to the wilderness. "Please," she whispered, clutching his sleeve, "please don't go." Daniel cupped her face gently, pressing his forehead against hers. "I'll come back for you," he promised, though they both knew it was a dangerous gamble. Kayla's tears spilled over, but she gave a shaky nod, too scared to argue further. "I'll stay by the fire," she whispered, her voice small. Just come back. Please." Daniel kissed her forehead, then stood, his legs trembling beneath him. He handed her the flashlight. "Keep it on. Don't let it go out. I'll be back soon." And with that, Daniel turned toward the woods, his heart hammering in his chest. He was running toward the wolves and toward Bear. The forest closed around Daniel like a predator's jaws, each step dragging him deeper into the unknown. Shadows slithered between the trees, and the cold air bit at his skin, making every breath sharp and painful. His thoughts were a chaotic mess of fear and determination. Images of Bear, alone and surrounded by wolves, propelling him forward. "Bear!" he called hoarsely, his voice cutting through the darkness. Silence. No response. The forest swallowed his cries whole, leaving him with nothing but the crunch of his boots and the racing thud of his heart. A low growl rumbled from somewhere nearby, raising the hair on the back of Daniel's neck. He stopped dead, scanning the shadows with wide eyes. They were close. Suddenly, a shape darted through the underbrush, a flash of fur and glowing eyes. One of the wolves! It stalked him from the side, its amber eyes glinting with hunger and malice. Daniel clenched his fists, trying to stay calm. He was being hunted. And he knew there was only one way out. He had to outlast them. With a sharp inhale, Daniel bolted forward, his feet slamming against the forest floor. He weaved between trees and over fallen logs, adrenaline surging through his veins. He could hear the wolf behind him, snarling and snapping as it closed in. It was toying with him, driving him deeper into the forest, right into the heart of the pack. Daniel stumbled over a root, falling hard onto his hands and knees. Pain shot through his arms, but he scrambled back to his feet just in time to see another wolf materialize in front of him, blocking his path. Its lips curled into a snarl, white teeth gleaming in the dim light. Panic surged through Daniel. They were everywhere. But then, through the chaos, he heard it, a familiar bark, desperate and defiant. "Bear!" Relief flooded Daniel's chest like a wave. "Bear!" he shouted, spinning toward the sound. Through the dense underbrush, Daniel saw his dog, his loyal German shepherd, barreling toward him, ears flattened and eyes wide with fear. And right behind Bear was the scarred wolf, its snarls growing louder as it closed the distance. "Come on, Bear, come!" Daniel yelled, urging the dog toward him. Bear leapt over a fallen branch, skidding to a halt beside Daniel. The dog panted heavily, eyes locked on the advancing wolves. Daniel dropped to one knee, wrapping his arms around Bear's neck, his heart thudding in his chest. "Good boy," Daniel whispered, burying his face in Bear's fur for just a second. A second they couldn't afford. The scarred wolf stepped into the clearing, its pack fanning out behind it. Their glowing eyes reflected the moonlight, their growls reverberating through the forest. They had cornered him, and this time there was no fire to save them. Daniel gritted his teeth, his mind racing. They wouldn't survive a fight, not like this. But then an idea sparked, a desperate, reckless plan. "Bear," Daniel whispered urgently, "you remember the river? Go, boy, go." The river was their only chance. It wasn't far, maybe a few hundred yards, but it was downhill, fast-moving, and deep. If they could reach it, they might escape. Bear hesitated for a split second, then seemed to understand. The dog barked once and bolted toward the trees, his body a blur of motion. "Good boy," Daniel breathed, sprinting after him as the wolves gave chase. The forest blurred around them, branches whipping against Daniel's face and arms as he ran. The snarls of the pack were right behind him, growing louder with every step. His legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. And then he heard it, the rushing sound of water, the river. They burst through the trees, skidding to a halt at the riverbank. The water churned angrily, swollen from recent rains, the current fierce and unrelenting. Bear stood at the edge, barking furiously at the approaching wolves. There was no time to think. "Jump, Bear!" Daniel shouted, and without hesitation the dog leapt into the river, vanishing beneath the foaming surface. Daniel didn't hesitate. He followed, diving into the icy water just as the wolves reached the riverbank. The cold hit him like a punch to the chest, stealing his breath. The current grabbed hold of him, dragging him downstream in a chaotic whirl of water and debris. He fought to keep his head above the surface, his arms flailing as the river swept him away. "Bear!" he choked, spitting out water. Where was Bear? For a moment panic gripped him, but then he saw it. A dark shape cutting through the water, paddling with powerful strokes. Bear. He was alive. Relief surged through Daniel, but the river was relentless, tossing them like leaves in a storm. They careened around a bend, narrowly avoiding a jagged rock, and Daniel's strength began to fade. He couldn't hold on much longer. Just as the darkness began to creep into his vision, he felt something solid beneath him. The riverbank! With the last of his strength, Daniel dragged himself onto the shore, coughing and gasping for air. Bear scrambled up beside him, dripping wet but unharmed. They lay there for a moment side by side, shivering in the cold night air. The wolves were gone, left behind on the other side of the river. Daniel rolled onto his back, staring up at the night sky. His entire body ached, and exhaustion weighed down his limbs, but he couldn't help but smile. They had made it. Bear nuzzled his side, letting out a soft whine. Daniel chuckled weakly, running a hand through the dog's wet fur. "Good boy," he whispered. "We did it." But as relief washed over him, so did the realization. Kayla was still back at the camp, alone. And the wolves weren't finished yet. Pell 5. Resolution. Reflection. 1,500 words. The night felt like it pressed into Daniel from all sides, thick and suffocating. As he lay on the riverbank, the cold seeping into his bones, the weight of what had just happened settled heavily in his chest. Bear lay beside him, alive but trembling. The wolves were still out there, beyond the river, and so was Kayla. He sat up, shivering uncontrollably. He couldn't stay here. Kayla needed him, and every second he waited increased the chance that the wolves might find her, or worse. Bear nudged his side with a soft whimper, sensing his owner's urgency. Daniel rubbed the dog's wet fur, giving him a tired smile. "Come on, boy," he whispered. "We're not done yet." With every ounce of strength he had left, Daniel pushed himself to his feet, stumbling slightly as his legs wobbled beneath him. Bear followed faithfully, staying close to his side as they trudged along the riverbank. There was no time to waste. They needed to find a way back to the campsite, and fast. The forest around them remained eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. Daniel kept his eyes peeled for any signs of the wolves, but so far the river seemed to have stopped their pursuit. As he trudged through the underbrush, wet clothes clinging to his body, Daniel's mind raced with guilt and fear. He had left Kayla behind. What if she was already gone? What if the wolves had found her the moment he had left? The thought twisted his stomach, making him feel sick. But then he remembered the way Kayla had looked at him, the way she had trusted him, despite her fear. He clung to that memory like a lifeline, using it to fuel every step forward. He had to make it back. He had to. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, Daniel and Bear finally found the trail that led back to the campsite. The firelight flickered faintly through the trees, a beacon in the darkness. "Come on," Daniel urged Bear, picking up the pace. They were almost there. As they stumbled into the clearing, Daniel's heart nearly burst with relief. Kayla was there, sitting close to the dwindling fire, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. Her face lit up the moment she saw them, and she jumped to her feet, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Daniel!" she cried, running toward him. He barely had time to react before she threw her arms around him, pulling him into a tight embrace. He felt her body trembling against his, and for a moment the two of them just stood there, holding on to each other as if the world might fall apart if they let go. "I thought—" Kayla choked, her voice muffled against his chest. "I thought you weren't coming back." Daniel pressed his lips to the top of her head, closing his eyes. He had come so close to losing her. And Bear. But they were here now. They were safe. "I promised, didn't I?" he whispered. Kayla pulled back slightly, her tear-streaked face breaking into a watery smile. "And you found Bear," she whispered, reaching down to ruffle the dog's wet fur. "I knew you would." Bear wagged his tail weakly, leaning into Kayla's touch, as if to say, "We made it." As the fire crackled softly between them, Daniel sat beside Kayla, feeling the warmth seep into his frozen limbs. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a dull ache in every muscle. But they had survived. And in the aftermath of it all, Daniel felt something else. A strange sense of clarity. Kayla leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wolves were gone, the night was quiet again, and they had made it through, together. Daniel stared into the fire, watching the embers dance in the cool night air. "They weren't evil," he murmured, almost to himself. Kayla glanced up at him. "What?" "The wolves," Daniel said quietly. "They weren't attacking us out of malice. They were just doing what they know, surviving." He paused, the weight of his own words settling over him. "Just like us." Kayla was silent for a moment, letting his words sink in. "I guess we all do what we have to when it comes down to it," she whispered. Daniel nodded. There had been moments tonight, decisions made in desperation, that would haunt him for a long time. But somehow they had all found their way through the darkness, and in the process Daniel felt something shift between him and Kayla, a sense of understanding, of shared struggle. Maybe, just maybe, they had found their way back to each other too. Bear let out a soft huff, settling down beside them with a contented sigh. He had saved Bear, he had saved Kayla. And in the end, they had all saved each other. The sky above them began to lighten, the first hints of dawn creeping over the horizon. The forest was still, at peace once more. "We should head back," Kayla whispered, though there was no urgency in her voice. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, let's go home." They stood together, packing up what little they had left. The forest that had seemed so menacing hours ago now felt different, like it had given them a second chance. They had seen the darkness, faced it head-on, and come out the other side. As they made their way back down the trail, Bear trotted ahead, his tail wagging lazily. Kayla reached for Daniel's hand, intertwining her fingers with his. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace, a fragile, beautiful thing that he would carry with him from this place. As the sun rose over the wilderness, casting warm light over the trees, Daniel glanced back one last time. Somewhere out there, the wolves remained, hidden, wild, and untouchable. He knew they hadn't beaten the wolves. They had only survived them, and in that survival there was a strange kind of respect, a recognition of the fine line between predator and prey, between man and nature. Daniel smiled softly. The wilderness hadn't beaten them either. Thanks for watching the video. For more video like this, You have to. Like the video, subscribe our channel, and press bell icon.